show with a top story this hour. What are Indians spending on and how much are they spending? The per capita monthly household expenditure has more than doubled in 2022-23 as compared to 2011-12. In fact, this household consumption expenditure survey also reveals that Indians are now spending lesser on food items and spending more on discretionaries like clothes and gadgets. We have two guests lined up to analyze what the outcomes of this survey mean for the economy. But first, let's take a look at this report by my colleague Aishwarya Patil on the key takeaways.
Ministry of Statistics comes out with annual numbers in terms of household consumption expenditure survey. Now, this survey indicates how we are spending our money, what we are consuming, and if we are leveling up our standard of living. In terms of this survey, it indicates from 2011-12 to 22-23, our household spending has more than doubled over a decade. As far as the per capita consumption in urban areas is concerned, that has gone up from 2,600 rupees in 11-12 to 6,500 rupees in 22-23. As far as the rural areas is concerned, that has also risen from 1,400 rupees in 2011 and 2012 to 3,700 to over 3,700 rupees in 22 and 23. The survey also indicates that there is a little bit more of tilt towards non-food consumption, which is discretionary consumption. And so, take a look at the next chart, which shows you the share of non-food spends. As far as the urban areas are concerned, that has risen to over 60% in 22-23, and back in 2011-12 it was a tad bit low, which was just 2% away in terms of non-food spends. In the rural areas, that has also seen an upsurge to 53% from 47% back in 2011 and 12. The share of food spends in urban areas, that has seen in fact a decline from 53% to 46% in 2022-23, and in the rural areas from 42% to over 39% in 2022-23. So these two indicators definitely give us a picture of the spends that consumers are gravitating to more towards entertainment, buying television sets, even apparels for that matter, but less on the food side.
All right, so lots of commentary coming in as far as rural and urban consumers are concerned. Also, the most important point being that more and more consumers are spending on discretionary items rather than on food items. And to discuss this further, I'm now joined by Siddhartha Sanyal, who's the Chief Economist and Head of Research, Bandhan Bank, and Saugata Bhattacharya, Independent Economist. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening on ET Now. I first want to come to you, Mr. Bhattacharya. There's been a lot of talk since morning about poverty alleviation. In fact, the Niti Aayog chief has also mentioned that. First, take us through, why is this survey very critical? Why is this survey important?
So thank you very much for having me on your show. Your colleague has been very, very comprehensive in describing the basic outlines of the survey. So two things. One, consumption, because this is something which was last seen in 2011-12. Remember that every year we get the GDP numbers and the private consumption numbers, but that doesn't distinguish between the urban and the rural areas. As your viewers will recall, I mean, there's been a steady narrative over the last 2 or 3 years that rural demand is not picking up, that FMCG sales, other consumer item sales in the rural areas has been relatively weak compared to the urban areas. Now, this is the first time that we have seen official data seems to suggest that rural demand and rural consumption is actually very robust. As your colleague said, rural consumption has more than doubled since 11-12, and that's a big number. And together with this, as you mentioned very correctly, that the pattern of spends seems to be shifting towards more urban-oriented items, which is also very important. One thing we must remember is that probably the role of retail credit, personal loans, other consumer loans, credit cards, etc., that would probably have played a role in this shift of consumption pattern. But this is a very important area, a very important pattern that seems to have suggest that there is a convergence between rural and urban consumption, which is very important for policy. And then finally, last, because this the weights, the shares of consumption translates directly into the shaping, into the pattern of the CPI index inflation, and which is very important because this is likely to reduce inflation significantly, and that will help the Reserve Bank of India and the MPC in what they decide on interest rates.
All right, that was pretty comprehensive, Mr. Bhattacharya. Let me come to you, Mr. Sanyal. The one criticism that economists and policy experts have often made is on income inequality, even though India's GDP has shown good, consistent growth. Does this survey then address that contrast between the top 5% and the bottom 5%?
Oh, well, if you see, this particular report is talking about the inequality, the measure of inequality or the Gini coefficient that is showing that the inequality is actually coming down. I think here the important factor is that that in many cases we have seen that the poorer section have, even if there is an absolute widening of gap between wealth and income of rich and the poor, in terms of percentage, the income uptick in case of rural India as well as in case of the poorer section had been pretty strong. So even if there is in some cases some widening of the absolute level of income, the poor section is also getting relatively richer, and which is a very significant point, because in that case they can also start thinking about investing a little more in terms of or going for a little bit of lifestyle upgradation, as well as investing a little more in the future generation, little more in education, etc., which eventually put them on some more equitable footing over a period of time or across generations.
All right, Mr. Sanyal, let me now come to you, Mr. Bhattacharya. Is there a need to then review the inflation basket, considering that a lot has changed, and will the government then take a relook?
Actually, in this rebooting of the inflation weights, the CPI index weights, is done almost automatically with the consumption survey that just precedes the compiling of the new GDP, the CPI basket. So one thing that is noticeable in this is that due to the fall in the share of food, particularly cereals, in inflation, this reduces the volatility of inflation. Remember, over the last 6, 7, 8 months, RBI, MPC, all of us have been talking about the wild swings in inflation, with the prices of cereals going up, prices of vegetables going up, etc. So the very salutary effect of this change in the consumption pattern is that the volatility of inflation is likely to come down. I'm not sure about the level of inflation, but the volatility comes down. So more stable inflation helps monetary policy, and this will lead to a reduction in interest rates, which is a very, very key item in boosting India's competitiveness. Remember, our interest rates relative to our emerging market peers is relatively high, and this will serve to reduce the pattern of inflation. One more thing I need to stress is that the share of food that has come down has actually led to an increase in the share of transport, particularly in the rural areas. Now, this is very important because transport typically means travel, and travel means opportunity. So this is actually serving to increase the opportunities that are available to many in the rural areas, and which is very important from the perspective of sustaining growth over a period of time. I'm sure that the amount of roads, the cars, automobiles, two-wheelers, etc., that have continued to be sold, and particularly two-wheelers in the rural areas, this is a manifestation of that sale of consumption of transport items.
Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya, and thank you, Mr. Sanyal, for joining us this evening to discuss that household consumption survey. I'll have to cut this conversation short. We have some breaking news coming in. Vijay